Whenever you are ready, I'll do the introductions.
Go ahead, Stan.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to Woodward Academy Debate Week 2013. I am your host, Mr. Jackson, and we have a series of lunch debates to kick off Debate Week. The first one entails the school voucher generally, and specifically the Georgia's involvement with the tax credit program. For those of you who are in the audience who want to chat live with me during this debate, you can do so by logging on to todaysmeet.com/WA_debate, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have while you are listening to this debate. If you have questions of the particular members as they are debating, please do so also using this URL address, and I will relay that information to the moderators for this debate. Now, without further ado, let me introduce the moderators. We have the director of the Woodward Academy Debate Program, Ms. Maggie Berthume, and who will be serving as one of the moderators. And we have the assistant director of the Woodward Academy Debate Program, Mr. Bill Batterman. Ms. Berthume and Mr. Batterman will be serving as moderators for this particular debate. Now, I will also introduce a couple of students who are in my fourth period government econ class, who have been kind enough to help me and assist me with Woodward Academy Debate Week 2013. And these two students will be introducing our special guests to Woodward Academy. So let me introduce my two students. Well, I have Garrett Snyder first, who you will see, and then I have Dari Hussein, who will be introducing our second speaker.
Catherine Dunn is a program officer at the Southern Education Foundation. She is a graduate of Elon University and of the University of North Carolina School of Law, where she focused on education, law, and policy. While at Elon, she interned for the NC Center for Public Policy Research and worked for a project promoting healthy lifestyles for Latinos in Alamance County. Salute Alamance, salute de Alamance. At UNC, she served as an articles editor for the North Carolina Journal of International Law and Commercial Regulation, an extern for North Carolina Court of Appeals Judge Barbara Jackson, and spent a summer in Costa Rica for Human Rights Law in America's program. She was a 2012 Atlanta Truancy Intervention Project Volunteer of the Year honoree.
Thompson is founder and managing director of Amera Public Partners, LLC, a civic engagement firm specializing in government relations, grassroots advocacy, and business development solutions for nonprofits, political campaigns, and corporate clients. He is a founder and chairman of 100 Dads, a grassroots advocacy organization of civic-minded dads. Mr. Thompson graduated from the University of Georgia with a Bachelor of Science degree in Agricultural Economics. He currently serves as Secretary of the UGA College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences Advisory Council, a member of the Georgia 4-H Advisory Committee, Parent-Teacher Advocacy Advisory Committee of the Georgia Charter Schools Associations, KIPP Metro Atlanta Advocacy Committee, and Board Vice President of Georgia Connections Academy. In addition, he is Vice Chairman of the Fulton County Republican Party. Mr. Thompson lives in Southwest Atlanta with his wife and 2 daughters.
All right, thank you all for coming. We're going to have a discussion, a debate, a dialogue, and it can be interactive. So as you're listening to this, think of questions. If you have a question, chat it to Mr. Jackson on today's meet, or write it down and pass a note to Mr. Jackson, and we will try to make this as interactive as possible. I want to thank both of you for joining us. I think, first of all, some of you probably know a little bit about the program that we're talking about, the Georgia Tax Credit Scholarship Program. But for those of you that don't, Mr. Thompson, you kind of specialize in taking these public policy issues, kind of making them clear to parents, to families. Would you mind, before we get into some more of the details, giving a little bit of an overview to our students here? We've got 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, 12th graders. What is the Georgia Tax Credit Scholarship Program?
Great. Here in Georgia, we have the opportunity for taxpayers, which I like to term as parents with children. Taxpayers receive a dollar-for-dollar credit for a certain amount of money that's invested into an account to offset the educational expenses for a particular child's education. At present, a taxpayer has the option to take the money they otherwise would spend in state tax dollars and contribute it to a fund called the Student Scholarship Organization. Those student scholarship organizations in turn take that pot of money and then they divvy it out in the forms of scholarships to students who apply to the various organizations.
Ms. Thompson's organization, Ms. Dunn's organization did a study of the Georgia program several years ago and has been at the forefront of advocacy in sort of opposing the program. Can you describe, Catherine, what the Southern Education Foundation, kind of why you went about this study, what you found, and kind of the conclusions that your organization has drawn from that report?
Sure, yeah. The Southern Education Foundation has a long history of supporting public schools throughout the South, but the lens of our work is really ensuring that low-income students of color in the South have opportunities to receive quality education that benefits them. And so when this law was being debated back in 2008, there was a lot of discussion about providing opportunities for those kids that SEF is concerned about. And we actually considered becoming one of the student scholarship organizations that takes these diverted tax dollars and distributes them as private school scholarships as a way of helping implement the law. Our board, however, took a look at the legislation that ended up passing in 2008 and decided that it was really, really ripe for abuse, and they'd rather us study how the law was implemented in its first couple of years, and we did that. We published a 2-year study in 2011 that found that Georgia's Tax Credit Scholarship Program wasn't serving the students that it was intended to benefit, these low-income students who were in troubled public schools and needed other alternatives. Unlike other states with tax credit scholarship programs, Georgia's at the time had no mention of income in the legislation at all, so any student of any income could receive a private school scholarship. There was language that said that an eligible student had to be enrolled in a public school. And early on in the program, there was a lot of work done to show that what was actually happening was students who were attending private schools currently were enrolling, filling out paperwork in their local public schools simply to qualify for a scholarship. So those kind of things really concerned us. And we published our study in 2011 calling for reforms to the legislation. Because of the fact that it wasn't serving the population it was intended to, at the cost of about $50 million a year.
I know that there have been some changes to the law since that sort of initial set of studies. Do you think that those changes resolve the issues that Ms. Dunn has raised?
I think they do. And one of the fundamental issues that I have with those who oppose the program as it's written is, I think the primary goal of the organization, primary goal of an SSO organization, is to provide educational opportunity for someone who's trapped in a school that's not serving their needs. And sometimes we often try to think that is only people who come from a low-income community. But quite frankly, there are lots of middle-class families who are struggling with educational options as well. So I'm confident that the program is serving the needs of the kids that it's supposed to serve, because it's about getting kids out of a situation that's not best for them and empowering them to be in an educational environment that has more options, one where they can have more cultural diversity, more ethnic diversity, more exposure to different things, and travel abroad. A lot of the programs that are not currently being offered in the traditional public school sector.
What have you all found about the students who are taking advantage of that program? Are they primarily low-income students or students who need more exposure to a different type of environment?
Well, given all of the evidence that has been uncovered of students who are actually filling out paperwork in their public schools in order to qualify, evidence shows that actually many of the students that are applying for these scholarships were already in private schools, were already attending these private schools and are now having subsidized tuition to attend the private schools. The legislation that was passed earlier this year requires now that students attend a public school for 6 weeks. There are some exceptions to that, but it was one of the improvements that was made this year.
So the difference between Georgia's program and the programs in other states, Georgia doesn't means test. Is that correct? So anyone is eligible for the scholarship, not just low-income individuals.
And that still is correct. We now have a requirement that student scholarship organizations should consider the income of a recipient, but no requirement that they actually provide scholarships to students who are low income.
My understanding is that the other change is that there's more transparency, so there has to be an audit with the Department of Revenue. What is the nature of the audit? What are they auditing?
And the audit actually has been a requirement since the beginning of the program, and what we were fighting for was access to that audit for the public, and we still don't have that. And the reason that we wanted that is because we, through studying the tax forms, the federal tax forms of these student scholarship organizations, which are public information, found quite a few instances of SSOs that seem to not be abiding by the law in terms of what they distribute of the taxes that are diverted to them. So they're required to administer about 90% of the funds that they receive for scholarships and can keep up to 10% of it for administrative costs. Didn't look like that was happening, but we didn't see the audits of these organizations. We still can't do that, and we worry that without specific enforcement language of the provisions that are required of these SSOs, that could continue to happen. But those are the kinds of things that auditors are looking for in there.
The issue of transparency seems like it's been one of the bones of contention from the beginning of this discussion. It seems like, depending on whether you consider an SSO basically a charitable organization where individuals are making voluntary choices to donate to charity, or whether it's a redirection of tax funds, that kind of changes what's expected in terms of disclosing information. How would you respond or defend the program and these issues of transparency? Do you think that the program is transparent enough? Do you think that transparency in that kind of data matters? Do you think that Georgia should continue down that road of making the program more transparent, or are you happy with the way it is now?
Well, I support more transparency in pretty much all government programming, provided that it respects the privacy of the individual. When you're collecting an abundance of data regarding the socioeconomic status of several thousand families and then creating some kind of a catalog which you could potentially publish to the general public, I don't necessarily think that protects the interests of the individual. To protect the integrity of the program, I fully endorse and support the auditing and reporting by the state, but I do have some reservations about providing all of that information to the public via any access other than that by a government agency.
I know one of the issues, in addition to sort of financial transparency, is access to information about the private schools that are getting student scholarship recipients. I know some of the other states that have done this have required those schools that wanted to be a recipient of scholarship dollars to publish information on graduation rates, information on SAT scores, and even some state testing. Do you think that Georgia's families have enough access to that data in order to be able to make an informed decision?
Well, I think the whole issue comes down to how much information do the parents want. If I am a parent and I would like to know what the performance of the school is, I think it's incumbent upon the parent to go and get that information themselves, because they will ultimately make the decision of where their kid attends school. Is it really a function of government to provide some huge database that says that this number of students receive X number of dollars for these schools in this particular region of the state? It could actually, I think, work to build some barriers to actual people taking advantage of the opportunity. We all know that the cost of a private school education in a metropolitan area is much greater than that of a rural area. So what would we do to make sure that everyone is looking at the data with the right frame of reference, as opposed to looking at one big number that some students may have versus another student may have in a different part of the state?
Same question to you. Do you think parents are getting enough access to data about the private schools to really give them a choice?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's a matter of a parent deciding to take a kid from a public school and spend their money on a private school tuition, that might be true, that we don't need to know how the students in the schools are faring as far as their academics. But I do think when we're talking about money that is essentially being taken away from our public schools, we've diverted almost $200 million over the past 4 or 5 years at a time when public school budgets are being cut, and those public schools are still held accountable to state and federal standards. I think it's true that we do need to know how those students who are being educated with diverted tax dollars are faring. Yeah.
If I may address the issue of taking away or diverting, actually I think that's kind of a jaded play on words, because the role of the state of Georgia is to educate its children. I mean, we decided that several hundred years ago in the Constitution. So the state has an obligation, and we actually put in the Constitution we will do that via taxes. So as a taxpayer, I'm not diverting my dollars. I'm simply directing the dollars where I want them to be spent. If that's in a traditional school, a public charter school, a private school, that is the right of the individual, because the money, it's still going into the same general operating fund. What we've decided to do over the last few years is to let a bureaucracy decide how that money is being spent, as opposed to the individuals who put the dollars into the pot in the first place, i.e. the taxpayers. And once again, I define taxpayers, parents, there's taxpayers with children. So it's not so much that we diverted dollars, it's just that we are directing them where it's best serves the needs of the family.
Given that you agree that the state of Georgia has an obligation to provide for the education of its students, ought not the state of Georgia to ensure that the students who it is assisting in some manner to attend private schools achieve some measure of academic success? Or do we just not, does the state of not have some sort of role in ensuring their success as well?
Well, I would say that they have the same role as they would ensuring the academic success in any other school. And right now, I question whether or not I have a very good litmus test for the traditional public school sector measuring up to the amount of investment that we spend. If you look on a dollar per dollar basis in many metropolitan areas, the amount of money we spend in reference to the percentage of graduation rates for many of our students, particularly here in metropolitan Atlanta, I would tend to say that that system is failed and is very flawed. While if you look at some private institutions, have much higher graduation rates. So it's a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways.
So on that issue of the performance of Georgia's schools, it seems pretty universally accepted that Georgia's public schools are struggling. The Southern Education Foundation, to my understanding, does support school choice, but school choice within the confines of the public education system, so charter schools and things like that. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're interested in, like I said, in ways that low-income students who are in schools that aren't serving them can have some more options. So yes, we do support.
So one of the things that I found interesting in doing the research about this is that the vast majority of the private schools that are beneficiaries of Georgia's G.O.A.L program are in the 5 counties with the highest performing public schools in Georgia. Can you talk about kind of what that means in terms of where students are coming from and going to, and how that affects the education standards in Georgia?
Sure, yeah, and that is where, many of our private schools across the state are concentrated. And so that's been an issue for us when we've seen budget cuts in public schools in rural communities that are severely damaging occur over the past 10 years, really. And I do think that states that have requirements that students be trapped or zoned or attending public schools that are not performing well tend to be the types of programs that we would support over Georgia's legislation, because if you're in a public school that the state is already financing that does provide a quality education, there isn't a need there.
So go ahead.
I would be curious to see the data that also does a contrast with, while the metropolitan has some of the highest performing schools, it also has some of the lowest performing schools. So there is, once again, it's a double-edged sword. We have just as much of a need for educational options in a high dollar, high income area as we do in any other part of the state.
I was gonna follow up. One of the things that it seems like parents are doing when they take advantage of the program is not just deciding based on kind of SAT scores or graduation rates, but they're looking for a full experience. So I know when Woodward advertises its experience to families. It's not just Woodward students excel academically. It's also that we provide a host of extracurricular activities. We provide, we have uniforms, a very kind of rigorous environment. There was a quote in the Augusta Chronicle about a family that sent their kid to Heritage Academy because they really liked the violin lessons, the uniforms, the structure. Can you talk about the importance of not just considering academic outcomes, but also the kind of the full experience that families are looking for when they choose where to send their child?
Well, as a parent personally, obviously I want my kids to do well academically, but the culture of high expectations goes well beyond just the classroom, as you spoke of. It's very important in this changing world that our kids are exposed to a variety of different cultures, a variety of different traditions, so that they can be well prepared, not only for Georgia, but for the world abroad. And unfortunately, many of our schools have a one-size-fits-all curriculum, a one-size-fits-all methodology of doing things. The beauty of having the option to attend schools like Woodward and others is that it's not one-size-fits-all. In many cases, the private school education is customized based on the needs of the child and the needs of the parent, and there's a little bit of a give and take that takes place in order to make sure it's a good fit before the child is even admitted or they make a choice of which school to attend. Those things are what's most lacking for our future students, our future employees in the state. It's not so much that our future employees in Georgia and the southeastern United States aren't academically prepared, but most Fortune 500 companies have consistently reported it's soft skills that students lack that is preventing them from being able to compete for many jobs that are coming to this area. We've gone from an agrarian to an industrial to a very service-oriented society. And if you don't have a mastery of those soft skills, it doesn't really matter how well you score on an academic test, a standardized test.
I completely agree that soft skills are extremely important. And we don't have the money to have arts and music programs and those kind of things, and for the public schools that are educating the vast majority of Georgia students, and that's a real problem. We're underfunding our public schools and cutting programs like that all the time.
But on that note, I'd have to disagree. Since 1950, the number of students in America has increased by 95%. But the amount of administrators and people the adults that work in education has increased by almost 700%. So when we sit back and we talk about how much money we have in public education to do things, it's not how much money we have, it's how we're spending the money that we have. I support spending more money on the child, on direct instruction, and not supporting, creating a jobs program or some kind of a bureaucracy. That is where we have misdirected billions, perhaps trillions of dollars over the last couple of decades. We need to put the focus back on the children and their future, and not so many adults that are tied into the system.
I do agree that there can be improvements to funding mechanisms of public schools, but we do still know that 2/3 of our school districts can't even operate at 180 days, that we've cut the budget for 10 years for public schools, that we're losing teachers at the same time as we're gaining more students in our public schools. And so there still is an issue of underfunding for basic needs in public schools.
One of the things that I'd like to sort of return to the tax program's effect on funding at public schools. I know that when the bill in Georgia was initially being debated, it was suggested from some sources that it would actually improve funding for public schools by, sort of ensuring that money went to schooling and removing students from public schools without reducing their funding. In the time since the bill has passed and the law has been in effect, has that been the outcome, or what have we found in terms of public school funding?
That hasn't been the outcome, and that goes back to the point about students who were already in private schools benefiting from these scholarships. So one of the big assumptions of that savings argument was that students would be leaving the public schools and going to private schools. And of course that's happening some, but that's not happening across the board. And we're also allowing students who are entering pre-K, kindergarten, and first grade to receive these scholarships. And those might be students whose parents never intended that they go to a public school. I also think it's a flawed assumption to assume that with every child that leaves the public school reduces their overhead budgets and things like that by the amounts that would end up saving them money.
Mr. Jackson.
Okay, I have a question from one of the audience members.
Absolutely.
Towards anyone, and here's the question. The individuals most likely to take advantage of the Georgia tax credit program are those with a large income and therefore a large tax rate. If those are the people putting their money into the private school system instead of the public school system, how are the public schools going to support the low-income students whose family incomes are not able to support sending money to private schools? Won't the public schools have even less money?
Well, I guess because you make a lot of money does not mean that you can put a lot of money in the SSO. There are limitations. By law, an individual can contribute $1,000 to an SSO program. A married couple can contribute up to $2,500. And if you happen to have a business, then you can contribute up to 75% of your business's tax liability. So there are some limitations to how much individuals can contribute. Merely because I have a high net worth and I have 10 kids and I want to send them all to private school, I'll just put $1 million in an SSO. That is not allowed. You can't do that within the framework of the law. And it was designed so that those things could not occur.
The last part about the 75% of a corporation's tax liability seems like a possible loophole there. If I own a corporation, I can donate 75% of the tax liability to an SSO that then might support the students that I have, my 10 students, for example?
That is the option, but the data shows that the vast majority of contributors are individuals. They're not corporations. So while that may be an option, historically, since this program has come into existence, it's been the individuals who help fund the various SSOs across the state.
Is that true both numerically in terms of number of donators and percentage of the amount donated? Because I would imagine, given that there's not a numerical cap on corporations, even if it were one corporation, they could presumably donate a lot more than $1,000.
I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but the data that I recall looking at a couple of weeks ago said that the aggregate, the total amount of dollars were contributed more on an individual basis than on a corporate basis.
Do you want to return to that question? Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. It is largely individuals, mostly parents that have been contributing to this program. I think it's between 60 and 70% of the money that's been raised over the past 4 or 5 years has been from individuals. And we actually, to speak to the issue of wealthy parents contributing to this program, we actually think that one of the big reasons for that has been that private schools advertise this program to parents through a loophole, or not even a loophole, but through the idea that parents can directly or indirectly designate a student to benefit from the contributions that they're making, which is illegal. It's been illegal since the beginning of the program under our tax regulations. We actually filed a complaint with the Department of Revenue earlier this year with 300 pages of documents describing how the student scholarship organizations and private schools have advertised this program to parents so that they will divert their tax dollars and benefit by getting a certain amount off of their child's tuition.
So you're saying schools are advertising that parents can actually get a discount on their
Right.
for their specific child?
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have other questions from the audience, Mr. Jackson?
Not specifically, but I have one. I would like for Ms. Dunn to expound on the lawsuit that you filed, if you would, and tell us a little more about what you perceive to be the outcome of the lawsuit.
Sure. What we've done is we've filed a report with the Department of Revenue, who has an Office of Special Investigations. So we've asked that they initiate a special investigation on this program to determine exactly how many and who has been contributing to this program and directly or indirectly designating a student to benefit. Because it's the case that you're not even allowed to indirectly designate a student that you know. It doesn't have to be your own child. But we still have seen, schools advertise that your child's entire tuition can be paid by encouraging your neighbor and your grandparent and your parent to divert their tax dollars to this program. And so we've simply asked them to investigate. It isn't actually even a lawsuit, but we would like them. What's that?
So what do you hope to get the outcome of either way?
We hope that that they will actually initiate an investigation and that they will require and enforce the components of the law, because it's been illegal for 4 or 5 years. It was made more clear in the legislation that passed this session, but we hope that the Department of Revenue will start enforcing the requirements of the legislation from here on out and not allow SSOs and private schools to advertise the program in this way.
So your only concern is that parents would donate to the program with the specific desire that that money go directly to their child
Right,
in a particular school?
right,
And that by law
is illegal, yes.
And I imagine.
And against the intent of the program as well.
Yeah, no, and I imagine that's also a way that you mentioned that parents and grandparents and family, friends, and that sort of thing can do that. I imagine that's a way of circumventing the $1,000 cap that Mr. Thompson.
Sure, which wouldn't
referenced.
necessarily cover
Sure,
the whole
well, that's
tuition.
tuition.
Yeah.
And I can simply say that I support all the transparency that you're speaking of. And I think it is, it does the program injustice for those that may or may not attempt to abuse it as the law is written. But I will say that a few bad apples does not spoil the whole barrel. I mean, the program in and of itself provides a lot more choice and opportunity to more kids that need it. And we should not let just a few people who may or may not, yet to be proven, try to take an alternate route to get something done, spoil the whole program. Because I'm sitting here thinking perhaps I should do a similar study in a traditional public school sector and ask them the same question: how many people that are enrolled with EIPs on a regular basis actually do qualify for an EIP? Because every time a kid gets enrolled with some kind of a special need, be it a speech impediment, be it dyslexia or something, that's an additional $2,500 that is added to the per pupil revenue for every traditional public school student. And it's been proven that a lot of kids who've been tagged as special ed, by the time they get to a private school, turn out to be borderline genius.
So the New York Times brought a lot of attention to the Georgia program last year when they released an article talking about some of what they alleged were abuses of the program, money not being spent on scholarships. Do you think that obviously Mr. Thompson describes that as a few bad apples? Do you think that is the whole apple tree? Do you think even Georgia G.O.A.L or some of the other more respected ones, the Catholic one, are equally liable for the harms of the program? Or do you think that it is really just an issue of some abuses?
Yeah, so we hear the few bad apples argument a lot, I think. And I definitely think that there are some SSOs that are operating the way the law was intended. But I think until the private schools who are using the money in the way that this program was intended, and the SSOs who are as well, actually join the fight to make this legislation a lot stronger. That argument doesn't really fly with me. You know, I think if you think that you're doing it the right way, we need to require that of everyone. I don't see why we would allow even a few bad apples. If we require every single scholarship recipient to be actually low income, to be in a troubled public school, if we can know the private schools that are educating these students and a little bit about their education, I think the legislation could be tremendously improved by those things. And I think that the SSOs who are saying they're doing those things should be a part of that movement to reform the legislation.
I'm just curious. I got to ask a question.
Yeah.
How is it that just by limiting the scholarships to low-income students, does that all of a sudden now make it more righteous and people are less likely to abuse and manipulate the system? I think if the program is going to have some challenges or some problems, that would be equally applied across the board. I mean, how do we preserve it by all of a sudden saying only this particular demographic of Georgia residents are going to qualify and everybody else, well, you don't count?
I mean, I think if we have a $50 million program, that is letting a certain number of students benefit each year from private school scholarships, we should target that to the kids who need it the most. I think that, those kids who truly have no options, whose parents don't even, have as a way to consider a private school education. I think that we need to make it targeted towards the kids who really have no other way to have access to different education if they need it.
I would imagine that for every wealthy student whose family could already attend a private school that gets that money, there is a poor student who can't get that money. It is a limited pot each year.
Right, it's a limited pot, yeah.
Would you support any percentage of the overall pool of money being designated for low-income students? So maybe 20% of the overall amount, anything like that? Or do you think that there should be no consideration of income at all?
What I'd say is I would encourage those who desire to start SSOs to consider having SSOs that specifically deal with certain socioeconomic group of Georgia residents. In fact, I know of at least two, one being Arete Scholars, which gives all of their funds, all of their scholarships to low-income families. But I don't think it would be in the best interest of Georgia students to limit the scholarships based on socioeconomic status. And I'll give you a little point to back it up. A couple of years ago, there was a report that was published by the Third Way Foundation. And in this report, what they revealed was that it's actually middle-class, middle-income families that are probably faring the worst off when it comes to getting to and through college. We spend so much of our resources focusing on closing the gap that we as an American society, we've forgotten about what it meant to raise the bar so that we can compete with our international counterparts. So if we spend all of the money just merely on a low-income student population and we totally forget about middle-income students and some of those middle to upper middle-income families, where do we ever close the competitive edge, narrow that gap that we have with our international counterparts across the waters who are literally importing more jobs than we're exporting because our kids don't have the math and science stamina to compete?
So would you support expanding, or you would not support means testing at any level? So middle income, even if the program were to say 50% of the scholarships need to go to low and middle income families to support, obviously, those middle income families that you've just identified as doing the worst in terms of educational outcomes, you think that that would not be something that your program would support?
I support the right of every citizen to have an option, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of their zip code, regardless of whether they were born in the rural or the urban parts of the state. Education opportunity has no boundaries. It should be available for everyone who's willing to take that extra step.
But realistically, some of that educational opportunity is already provided to students whose families can afford private school, yes?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So looking forward, what is your vision for the Georgia Tax Credit Scholarship Program, how that kind of fits into school choice in Georgia? If you, let's say you were the governor, you were appointed, you got absolute power for the next year, what would your educational reform agenda be in Georgia?
Absolute power.
Absolute power.
Wow. I don't know if I want to answer that one just yet. I would support a continued expansion of the program. I think we actually started out with $50 million, and we were able to raise that cap through a lot of negotiation to $58 million. Quite frankly, when you sit back and you look at the billions of dollars that we invest in public education and the small amount that we're allocating toward these tax credit scholarships, I don't see why we'd even limit it to $100 million. I would support creating a system where we can create better efficiencies in the marketplace by having more competition. If we can currently spend somewhere in the neighborhood of $13,000 per child in the Atlanta school system, but yet there are private schools all around the metropolitan area that are doing that for considerably less, then why should we continue to spend more and more in one particular sector and not have people the opportunity to go engage in another, which is doing it much more efficiently? Let's let the marketplace dictate what's best for the child and not a bureaucracy.
Let me ask the same question of you. Let's say you're the governor, you get carte blanche over education policy. What is kind of your vision for Georgia's education system going forward?
Yeah. I think there's been a lot of movement in Georgia for education reforms over the past couple of years. A lot of talk about what works and what doesn't, which is a great thing. But I think we're experimenting a little bit too much when we do know some things that work, that we are underfunding. So I would expand Georgia's pre-K program. There's no doubt that access to pre-kindergarten as a 3 or 4-year-old child has long-term benefits on a child's educational path. I would invest in, making sure that all of our school districts are funded for able to operate at 180 days, that they can have things like graduation coaches and support that has been cut from especially rural districts across Georgia. And so I think that there are some things that we know work, and I think it's time to fund those things before we try any more experiments.
Mr. Jackson.
Yeah,
I have a question for Mr. Thompson. You mentioned about the marketplace of ideas and marketplace, let the marketplace dictate education, etc. And I have a question. The question I have for you is, do you see any role that public education has that the private marketplace wouldn't do better? And if there is a role, how would that public education look, and how would it be funded? If you think we should expand the Georgia taxpayer program to even a larger amount than it already exists?
Well, to answer your question, I'm going to have to take liberty and go back to what his original premise was. If I had unlimited power. To answer your question, if I had unlimited power, I would take the total amount of money that we're currently spending now, and instead of letting 180 different school districts determine how they want to spend that within the 180 different inefficient systems, I would take all of those dollars and I would figure out what it costs to educate a child in Georgia. And I would create something called an educational savings account like they've done in Arizona. And I would give that to each child to be directed by their parent so that they can make a decision whether or not they want to send their kid to a traditional school right around the corner, a public charter school across town or around the corner, or a private school if they're choosing. I think that is where you would allow the free market to really dictate. Because just like private school has its own operating expenses, traditional school has its operating expenses. But right now, it's kind of hard for them to compete on an even keel because one is being 100% subsidized by the taxpayer, and then we have another program which up to now is only $58 million of a $7 billion budget being subsidized by the taxpayer. So let's put them on the same even keel. Under that circumstance, then the free market will rise to the top, and we will be able to determine who can best do the job of educating our kids.
So under your program, the education tax dollars would follow the individual student, not the school where the student happens to reside.
Absolutely. Let's not fund systems, let's fund students.
All right, and Ms. Dunn, would you care to comment on that particular system in which the general education tax dollars would follow each individual student and not the school district where that student's parents happen to reside?
Yeah, the thing that concerns me about the money following a student is that there are a lot of kids in Georgia and across the U.S. Whose parents aren't invested in their education, who don't know, who aren't necessarily informed about making a choice. I think we start creating dual school systems for the have and have not students in our state and across the U.S. when we do that. I think we really start segregating our school districts among, those, or our schools among those whose parents are making these decisions, and students who are from low-income families whose parents might work multiple jobs, who aren't making the same informed decisions that other parents are making.
So, Ms. Dunn, are you of the opinion that the government is better able to make the decisions about the students' educational welfare greater than the parents?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sitting up here and saying that public schools are perfect, but I do think that that they are the best mechanism for educating all of Georgia's students, and that we should be using all of these efforts to ensure that we make our public schools the best option for students.
All right, now, seeing that we have 2 more minutes to wrap this up before we have to dismiss the students so we can enter the next period class, I would like to thank everyone on the panel for this great discussion. And I want to give each side maybe 1 minute closing arguments that they make to follow up this debate. Mr. Thompson, go first.
Sure. Well, I'd say, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. I've enjoyed this experience. And I think the takeaway, the value proposition I'd like to leave you with is that it's more important that we focus on the child and not preserving systems. While the majority of kids do attend the traditional school sector here in Georgia, I think we all would agree that we could do better. And I would like to support any system, and this tax credit scholarship being one of them, that provides more choice and more opportunity so that we can actually do what public education is all about. And that is, we want to talk about the concept of educating the public, not the delivery system. Let's focus on the concept of public education and not the delivery system.
All right, Ms. Dunn?
Sure. Yeah, I would just say that we should be investing in all of Georgia's children through our public schools, but with choice options. But making sure that every single student in Georgia has access to a quality education.
All right, well, thank you very much. We appreciate it.